Welcome to our 112th day on the trail. We have four readings for today from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 25, Numbers 19, verse 1 through 29, the 101st Psalm, and Judith chapter 14, verse 11 through 15, verse 7. While I would like to focus our time today on the story of the wedding in Cana from John's Gospel, I feel the need to mention this very important story in Numbers 20. Therefore, our time together today may be a bit longer than usual. Now, in Numbers 20, a vast majority of the generation who actually experienced slavery in Egypt and the events of the Exodus have died. Therefore, a new generation is standing before Moses. However, with this new generation, we find a complaint that reflects a previous encounter found in Exodus 17. In that story from Exodus, we find this, beginning in verse 2. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" This is very similar to the story we find in Numbers 20, which takes place 40 years later. Here we have a similar problem, a similar solution, and even the same name of the location, Meribah. And even the complaint that the people make to Moses is very similar. So now turning back to Numbers 20, beginning in verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they assembled together against Moses and against Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, and they said, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the face of the Lord. Why have you brought the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness? For us and our cattle to die there? Why did you make us come up out of Egypt, to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of seeds, or figs, or vines, or pomegranates. There is no water to drink." As we read this passage, we should remember that this is a new generation. They did not know slavery in Egypt, or at least it would have been a very distant childhood memory. How did this new generation know what life in Egypt was even like? How can a generation who never knew slavery prefer it? The only possible explanation was that they had received this information from their parents. They listened to their parents' stories and carried their perspective of the good old days forward. This is true today as well. Our children not only listen and absorb what we say and the stories we tell, but they watch our actions carefully. This is why we should always be vigilant about what we pass on to our children, both in our attitudes and our actions. Now, back in the first story in Exodus 17, God instructs Moses to take his staff and strike a particular rock at Mount Horeb. When Moses did as God commanded, water gushed forth from the rock. Now, 40 years later, the outcome is very different for Moses. Beginning in Numbers 20, verse 7, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and you shall speak to the rock before their eyes, and it shall give its water. Thus you shall bring water out from the rock for them, and provide drink for the congregation and their cattle." So what has changed in God's instructions to Moses? This time, God tells Moses to speak to the rock instead of striking it. So why this change? Well, we don't know. We can speculate, but there is no explanation given. This is simply the way that God wants Moses to bring water from the rock. Now skipping to verse 10. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the face of the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with the rod twice. Abundant water came out, and the congregation and their cattle drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land that I have given them." After encountering God at the burning bush, confronting Pharaoh, watching Egypt suffer under horrific plagues, leading Israel through the Red Sea on dry ground, bringing the Torah down from Sinai twice, and leading the people for 40 years. After all of that, Moses will not be allowed to enter the Promised Land. He will only see it from Mount Nebo. So why? Why did Moses warrant such a harsh punishment? Why is Moses no longer fit to lead the people? God tells Moses and Aaron in verse 12, "Because you did not trust me." But how? How did Moses and Aaron not trust God? By striking the rock twice? Well, yes, God did tell Moses to speak to the rock. But that is only part of the problem. Listen again to how Moses addresses the people in verse 10. "Listen, you rebels. Shall we bring water from the rock?" When this happened 40 years ago, with the previous generation, Moses struck the rock and it worked. Water burst forth from the rock. So Moses strikes the rock again, like he did before. But not only does Moses not follow God's specific instructions about speaking to the rock, Moses was trusting in himself and his past actions rather than God. And in doing so, Moses claims glory for himself instead of glorifying God. So how did Moses, who was called the humblest man on the face of the earth in Numbers 12, begin thinking that he could bring water from the rock by himself? It happened slowly, over years. And if this can happen to Moses, it can happen to us as well. We can become complacent, believing that we have everything figured out, defaulting to our way of living, and failing to give thanks to God in the process. All it takes is time and apathy. Now turning to John chapter 2, we find the first of Jesus' miracles that are mentioned in the Gospel of John. This is also one of the 7 signs that Jesus performs in John. I have included a list of the 7 signs here. Once again, we are reminded that the number 7 represents wholeness or completeness, and John mentions specifically that this is a sign in verse 11. Now reading from John chapter 2, verse 11, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So if this is only one of 7 signs that John decides to record in his gospel, what is the importance of these signs? And how do they differ from miracles in general? Well, typically signs, while they have a real and tangible element, they also point to something bigger than what they are. Signs participate in the reality to which they point. So at the wedding at Cana, what is the sign that the miracle points to? What is the larger meaning behind turning water into wine? Is there more here than rescuing the host of the banquet? Now, despite the importance that John places on this particular event, it seems that Jesus is reluctant to participate at first. In verse 3, when the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." While this may seem unsettling, Jesus does seem annoyed by his mother's request. After all, Jesus' active ministry only lasts 3 years, or a little over 1,000 days, and yet he chooses to spend an evening at a wedding. But why does he say to his mother, "What concern is that to you and to me?" Even various translations struggle here. The NIV tries to interpret this awkward Greek construction by translating, "Woman, why do you involve me?" The King James is a bit harsher in its tone. Woman, what have I to do with you? And the CEV goes in a completely different direction. Do not tell me what to do. These are all very different in their interpretation and tone. However, when we look at this Greek phrase, when it appears in other places in the New Testament and the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, such as found in 2 Kings 3:13 or 1 Kings 17:18, we find that this phrase may mean something like, "What is between us that is bothering you?" Or perhaps, "Why are you coming to me?" Or even, "What does this have to do with us?" So what is Jesus' point here? Is he asking, how does this matter to us? Or how is this our problem? Also notice that Jesus calls his mother simply woman. Again, this seems a little harsh or indifferent at best. But I believe the author has another point he is driving at here. Jesus uses this term with 3 women in John's Gospel: the Samaritan woman at the well, Mary Magdalene in the Garden of the Resurrection, and of course, his mother, twice. In fact, this is the only word he uses to address his mother in John's Gospel, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Mary's name is never mentioned in the Gospel of John, and she's only mentioned twice in the entire Gospel. Here, at the wedding in Cana, Jesus' first sign, and one other place, at the crucifixion, when Jesus says, "Woman, here is your son." This is our first real hint to understanding why this story was so important to John. The mother of Jesus provides the first link to what this story is really all about, and even the point that John is trying to highlight. And this takes us to the second marker, or the second hint to John's reason for including the story. As we mentioned in our introduction to John's Gospel, we are looking for pairs, which John often uses throughout his Gospel to add depth and to highlight important concepts. So look at the end of verse 4. Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." This is the main reason Jesus gives for not wanting to get involved. So if this is not his hour, when does his hour come? If not now, when? If John intentionally mentions Jesus' mother only twice, here at the beginning of the Gospel, and again at the end during the crucifixion of Jesus, we see the same pairing here. Before Jesus' first sign, he says, "My hour has not yet come." Then toward the end of the Gospel, in John 17, verse 1, we read, "After Jesus had spoken these words, he looked up to heaven and said, 'Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, so that the Son may glorify you.'" At the first sign of Jesus in Cana, Jesus tells his mother that his hour has not yet come. Then, as his earthly mission is drawing to a close, Jesus tells his Father that his hour has come. Therefore, it appears that this first sign of Jesus in John points to and connects with the crucifixion and the end of Jesus' ministry before returning to his Father. So we may ask, how does this event in Cana connect with the crucifixion? How is John connecting these two events, and what is the point that he is trying to share with us? Beginning now in verse 5. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. but you have kept the good wine until now." These 6 jars would have held 153 gallons, serving approximately 2,400 cups of wine at the party, that incidentally had already run dry. So standard practice was to serve the best wine first, and when palates became dull, the lesser wine would be served. However, as the steward points out, Jesus provides the best wine at the end. However, there's another question that I find myself asking. Why start with water? Could Jesus just have filled the jars with wine while they were still empty? If he can convert water to wine, could he have just used the empty containers and saved the stewards the trouble of filling them with water? But notice that these were special stone jars used for purification. As Jesus repeatedly tells his followers throughout his ministry, true purification does not begin on the outside, but on the inside. So the water for purification of the outer body is now taken into the body in the form of wine. And this also connects the wine served in Cana of Galilee to the wine Jesus shares with his disciples and us at the Last Supper. When Jesus takes a cup filled with wine and shares it with his disciples, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." As followers of Jesus, where does our true purification begin? With the purification that Jesus offers when he sacrificed his life for us on the cross. So there's a beautiful dichotomy here. At Cana, Jesus was invited to a wedding feast where he saved a celebration. And far more than that, because of his sacrifice on the cross, we are invited to his table and the great wedding feast of his kingdom at the end of the age. So at Cana, Jesus fulfilled his mother's will. At the cross, his Father's. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.